Welcome to the Good and Basic Podcast. We are back after a hiatus and very glad to be here with Joseph and Joseph, where we talk about technology, history,
ethics,
philosophy,
and the fusion of all these topics intermerged in this thing that we call appropriate technology.
all the things.
Applying the right thing to the right time in the right way.
Yes. So speaking of, this has been so long, I'm already flubbing it. You can find our social media information in the description below, and we also hope you'll check out our other project videos, which, to be fair, that's probably how you found us.
Yeah.
As it were, here we are, and we want to talk about a specific, you could call it an appropriate technology, if you can call like a lifestyle a technology. We thought it would be really interesting to talk about homesteading.
And why it keeps making a comeback during horrible times, and how big this particular comeback is going to be, and whether it's the kind of thing that should make a permanent comeback as opposed to just a recurring one.
Yes. Yeah, okay, well, I mean, that's a good list of questions right off the bat, right? Specifically after you recorded the book by Ralph Borsodi, the name of which is escaping me.
Flight from the City.
Flight from the City,
yes.
Which is about Ralph Borsodi's homesteading adventure, you could call it. And the time period on that is?
1936, I believe.
Okay, so he's a post-Great Depression homesteader.
During.
I guess that'd be during the Great Depression. Yeah,
Yeah.
So he's a during the Great Depression homesteader. So obviously, Other Joseph released all the chapters in audiobook form on our channel, which is pretty legit.
Currently, they're only on the YouTube channel, so if you want to listen to them, they're currently only in YouTube video format. But soon, we're hoping to release them on the podcast format, so you can listen to them without streaming video.
Mm-hmm. So that's sort of one intersecting line of this discussion, and then another intersecting line of this discussion is, specifically the coronavirus pandemic and the fallout from that, and as you said, is this, are we going to see a comeback of homesteading?
Yeah.
And then another intersection line is sort of just, independent of any sort of like historical shocks, like the Great Depression or the coronavirus pandemic, right? Like, is this a viable thing that could just happen all the time in large numbers, and how good would it be for people to do that?
I think a couple of questions that we should work on first to begin the conversation are, one, it would be helpful to talk about some of the history of the homesteading movements that have emerged during the Great Depression, during World Wars I and II, the 1970s, of course, and then most recently in 2008. There's been kind of a recurring interest which has been kept alive via the blogs and the YouTube channels that have sprung up around the idea. There is a lot of diversity around the idea of what homesteading means, and so we need to be pretty particular about our definitions. Some of the people that I run with and talk homesteading with are anti-technology in kind of a strange way, in a very similar way to Sylvia and John from Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. They have kind of this visceral quality detector, he would call it romantic quality, aversion toward the technological beast.
It's these darn kids on their Game Boys and stuff.
It's these darn kids on these Game Boys, and it's the new stuff is bad.
Yeah.
So let's go back to some halcyon day of old and live that way. And they're looking very much backward.
Okay.
I do not fall into this model very much. I like looking backwards for tips, tricks, life hacks, things that people used to know how to do. For instance, nobody cooks anymore. Mm-hmm. So if you want to learn how to keep a kitchen and make it productive and tasty and beautiful, you're going to find a lot of stuff from like the 50s and 60s back when that was hip.
Yes.
And if you want to learn more about making your own clothes,
when that was a thing that everyone did.
Yeah.
Or that a very large number of people did.
The classic NES, the first Nintendo machine that came out in the 1980s, they came out with all kinds of crazy attachments. And this tells you something about the 1980s. One of those attachments was a knitting machine. A programmable knitting machine.
You're joking.
I'm not joking. It was the Nintendo knitting machine. You could knit a sweater on your Nintendo using that as the central processor. And I mean, that's a thing. We've had moments in our history where we've been more interested in making our own stuff than we are today, up to and including Nintendo knitting machines. Mm-hmm. So it's important to define what you mean. For me, the key elements of homesteading are home production of the necessities of life. So if you're producing stuff at home that you yourself are going to use, that's homesteading in my mind. It's most importantly homesteading if you're producing food and shelter, like the super basic stuff. But if you're doing home meal prep, if you are learning to do your own computer repair, I kind of keep this in the same sphere of influence.
Which is really interesting to me because I think when most people think homesteading, and when I think homesteading, you know, I'm thinking of certain things like moving to a rural area, right? I think chickens.
Yeah.
I think a garden, and I think a wood stove fire.
You think
Now, these are kind of just like my sort of like gut level reactions and
then
impressions.
there's overalls, and you're like, you've got a horse-drawn carriage, and you're imagining like some combination between poverty and being Amish.
Oh, okay, yeah. I guess. Wow. Okay, I guess that was what I was imagining.
Fortunately, that isn't offensive to anyone who's watching this video, but by definition, that's terrible. That's terrible. Lots of respect.
Yeah, and this was actually something that I was really hoping we would get into, because like I'm really interested in thinking. Now, I do think that sort of like a return to homesteading following one of these shocks like the coronavirus pandemic will probably include moving to more rural areas, because there do seem to be some of the things attached to city living and so forth. But I am really interested in the question, okay, like if we squint at this homesteading thing, like, you know, what kinds of changes can we make to it that would be good, right? Like, you know, you mentioned like home production. Well, like, could you do home production on like a suburban 3rd-acre, 1/4-acre lot? What kinds of home production could you do in a city apartment, right?
Yeah. I think the key question is, are we talking about a sufficiency for yourself? Because then we're talking about minimums. There is a certain minimum geographic area that's going to provide all the food that you need. And that area can be a lot smaller than you're imagining. There is a family in Southern California that's managed to produce all of the necessities for their life, like all their food, and all their income comes from their, I think it's 1/6 of an acre that they're putting in heavy production. But they're kind of cheating, because they're bringing in, they're not composting all their own stuff. They're not self-sufficient in terms of that. They're having to collect compost from the local area. And they also have to buy their staples like grain and sugar by selling expensive microgreens to local restaurants. So they're having to participate in the economy in order to provide their needs. The thing is, they can do that growing food on 1/6 of an acre, and that's amazing. So the space question is interesting. Can everyone, even in an apartment, do more of their own production? Yes. Buy a washer and dryer. That's homesteading. I mean, on a certain level, you are providing for a need that you have using a very appropriate technology, and that partakes of the same essence.
Yeah, I'm
And
going
if
to
you'll
pause
excuse me a moment, I'm going to get the door.
Would you? Looks like the other one's closed, so we're good. Gosh, I really hope that didn't.
I think it'll be all right.
Okay. Was distracting, so I'll get out though. Okay, I'm going to do it quick. Because I don't think I did that earlier for the lavalier mic. Yeah, well, and so like at least my attitude about it is that I'm very like, gates open, come on in, right? Like a washer and dryer does count as homesteading, right? Like a kitchen does count as homesteading.
Or maybe home production.
Or a gradation of homesteading, let's say, right? It's, I mean, it is not the same thing as living on 400 acres in Wyoming. It's not that, right? But it is a gradation on that path, and a worthwhile gradation.
Very,
right?
very much.
A worthwhile gradation. Well, and I mean, like a lot of people do actually have washers and dryers, right?
And
like they have a foot in what you and I would say. You and I would say they have a foot in the spirit of homesteading, right? They're already partially in that territory.
Yeah.
They just don't recognize it yet, perhaps.
Yeah, especially since there's that. When you think the word homesteading, I mean, the image that came instantly to mind was kind of a mixture between poverty and being Amish.
Like a log cabin type.
Yeah, log cabin, roughing
livestock.
it. You imagine roughing it. Like
Yes.
whatever you're imagining includes roughing it. In
Yeah.
my vision of homesteading, washer and dryer is an essential. Electricity is essential, but there's ways of providing even electricity yourself. I mean, solar is now cheaper than coal, which is why so many solar companies have popped up all over, in particular the Salt Lake Valley. You see billboards absolutely everywhere, hundreds of competing companies trying to get you to pay less money than your current power bill, and yet they still make a profit.
Yeah.
Because we've now crossed that line. And
Which
that's
is
an incredible thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, current technology is there. I have friends who have done off-grid solar setups for an entire home for $6,000. Granted, they know how to get the cheap parts from China and cobble together a system, but still.
But it's a thing that can be done.
Yeah,
right?
that's 20
It's
years.
inside the realm of possibility, and it's even inside the realm of possibility. If you want to be a hobbyist about it, there's going to be a learning curve. You're probably going to make a couple mistakes along the way. Hopefully, you don't fry yourself, right? But
yes.
But it's doable. It's possible, right? It's not like building a rocket in your backyard and going to the moon. It's something that you could do.
And it's also something you can scale. I mean, you can start with a little solar setup that's this big that charges your lawnmower or whatever, and then upgrade that to something that can run your house.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the mistakes. As long as they don't kill you, as long as you keep the mistakes small enough, they're an education. One of the things that I find so interesting about home production and taking more of the burdens of those things that you consume. You know what you consume. If you like music, start learning to play music. If you like computers, learn to take apart and work with computers. But by expanding into this realm and trying to take care of your own needs, you become a very well-rounded, what we would call a Renaissance man or Renaissance woman.
Yeah.
You become, like, it just enriches your life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Speaking of, so we're talking about, to what degree does homesteading imply or require a log cabin, basically. I'm just going to use that as my placeholder for that.
40 acres and a cow.
3 acres and a cow. 3 acres and a cow, 40 acres and a cow, some number of acres and a cow.
40 acres and a mule, 3 acres and a cow. Depends on whether you're British.
If you're in America, it's 40 acres and a mule.
Yeah, because we're land hungry. Very, very land hungry.
Yeah. And also not enough cows, apparently, to go around.
Yeah, apparently not. Mule, gosh, that's perpetual dependence. That's what that means. You have to buy a new one every generation.
Anyway, so this is something that I'm particularly interested in related to our shock, to this current shock, the coronavirus pandemic, the shock to the economy, right, that could precipitate a return to homesteading. And what makes it interesting to me is that, so many people have had a crash course in how to do, and so many companies also have had a crash course in how to do online work.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, a lot of people will go back to offices, but it seems pretty fair to say that a lot of people won't go back to offices, right? Or they'll work, 2 days a week in the office, 3 days out, or some arrangement like that, right?
Yeah.
And some will not go back to the office at all. And so, don't you kind of squint at the coronavirus pandemic and you're like, this is kind of a golden opportunity for homesteading because you actually can have a blue-collar office job and not live in a city.
Blue collar?
White-collar office job.
I was about to say.
White-collar office.
I understand what you mean.
White-collar office job and not live in a city, right? In Ralph Borsodi's time, right? There are certain jobs that if you want, you will have to be in the city.
Yes.
Right.
And that's still true today.
And that's still true, but the number,
proportion.
exactly, the proportion is different now, right? And the proportion, to a greater degree, favors, moving out into the boonies or even moving out into the suburbs, right? Getting away from the large population centers in the cities. And I do think that, you have to wonder, right? Well, we will have to watch and see, but you have to wonder if the return to homesteading this cycle will be proportionally larger because it's more possible.
Dearly, dearly hope so. And there's a few reasons why. I'm going to speak doom and gloom for just a moment, and then I'm going to make a very positive sales pitch. Let's see how this goes.
Bring it on.
Bring it on. So the doom and gloom is this. For as long as you do not control where your food comes from, whoever does control your food owns you. And you can be starved out of wherever you live. Right now, if you live in a city, you're never more than 3 days away from riots. If the supply lines to where you live get cut off and you get cut off from food, this sounds hyper dire, because it is. If you live in a city and if you are dependent on your food supply from other people, all it takes is for the semi-trucks full of groceries to stop running and you don't have food anymore. And then it only takes a few days of people being hungry and frustrated in order for societal order to break down. Now, as doom and gloomy as that sounds, I personally have maybe more of an emotional attachment to the idea of being secure in having food. And so a garden large enough to sustain myself is something that has always been on the list of things that I desperately, desperately want. So that's doom and gloom. Have food. That would be an important thing. That is kind of the heart of this homesteading thing. Own your home, own your food. So neither can be taken away from you. Now, the second idea and the sales pitch is this. If you can work online with whatever income you're having right now, that income level is this. It's going to stay the same. And if you can move to the country where the cost of living is lower, particularly for things like real estate and your house, then your standard of living could just jump like this instantly if you were to move. And you might say, oh, that would be horrible. That would be a horrible hardship. Amazon 2-day shipping still works beautifully well in the country, and Hulu streams everywhere. So does Netflix. So, if you can bring your job with you, you can bring your entertainment with you, you can, And you have an opportunity to be a builder. I mean, if there isn't a whole lot of community there, start it. I mean, you can be part of that change to revitalize the rural parts of the world. So that's kind of the sales pitch, is that you could have a higher quality of life, more space, more freedom, more peace, and you could do it, and a higher standard of living. Like, this is a big deal. The idea of homesteading does not necessarily mean log cabin and horses and overalls and
Now more than ever.
squeaking out. It means washers and dryers and off-grid solar and, you know, the gentleman farmer.
I do have to say, I am not nearly as cynical about cities as you are.
No.
I do need to register that, and I don't know if we want to get into it now, but I would be happy to launch a rejoinder against.
Please do.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, so cities.
Sure.
If your food supply gets cut off, you all die, right? Well, first you riot and then you die.
Yeah.
Right, and a lot of people die in the rioting, and then a lot of people die of starvation. Good times, right? However, there's some other dynamics here at work. One really interesting dynamic at work is that yes, other people have a knife to your throat in terms of food, but you also have a knife to their throat in terms of X, right? Whatever it is that you are trading for food, right? So, for instance, if the New York Stock Exchange goes down, right? Like, if the world of finance goes down, like, that actually has consequences, and people will sacrifice to keep the financial system going, because if it goes south, that will have consequences for everybody across the world, right? So a city like New York City, like, in some sense, the food suppliers have a knife at their throats, right? But oh boy, if you think that Tyson Chicken doesn't have a knife to their throats from the financial system and from banking and from all sorts of other infrastructural things.
It's a giant mutual trust
Yeah,
fall
everybody is
direction.
everybody is pointing a gun at everybody, or more optimistically, it's a trust fall.
Yeah,
right.
it's a trust fall.
So that's one thing I'd say. Another interesting thing that I just want to point out.
And there's a point that I want to throw in favor of
Sure.
what you just said, which is that, and it works so far.
Yeah.
And it has worked
and if
so far. And that's a beautiful thing. My trouble comes with the fact that if you look in history, there are crises, and I don't believe in the apocalyptic crisis, really.
Mm-hmm.
Like, saying the entire world's going to end and everything's going to revert to cannibalistic barbarism, and it's going to be like Cormac McCarthy's The Road. No, is that Cormac McCarthy? I forget.
I don't know, but I think everyone can visualize exactly what you're talking about. We live in an era where people think about this kind of thing.
The Walking Dead,
Yeah,
Quiet Place, name
all
off
the
your
stuff.
favorite
All the
post-apocalyptic fiction. There's tons of it. But I'm not worried so much about that. Let's just talk about a depression, like the Great Depression.
Sure.
Let's say that the Great Depression is a thing that happened, therefore it's a thing that can happen. Let's say it happens again. Would you rather be on a farm with chickens and vegetables, or in an apartment complex, walking from place to place trying to find work?
There is, okay, so you do raise a good point. There is sort of like this insurance factor here, right? Like,
Huge.
My chickens are my insurance company,
Yes.
right? They insure me against giant shocks.
And do
to
they
the
have
economic system.
dependencies? Yes, they have dependencies against weather, disease,
Sure.
your access to feed.
Yeah, and
I mean,
I don't mean to say that there are no risks
But-
associated with living in a city.
one of those dependencies that is not on the list of things that the chickens need is the financial system. I mean, so long as you're able to grow
True.
that corn yourself.
True. Okay. Yes,
Yeah.
they don't. Everybody else needs the financial system.
Maybe not the chickens.
The chickens seem to have thus far escaped
Yeah. So,
the shackles of modern finance.
may it ever so be. Well, I mean, you have fruit trees. You have, I mean, at a certain level, your dependence is water, sunshine, time.
There's actually one other point that I do want to bring out, and I raise it not because it's such a good argument in favor of my case, but because it is a very interesting fact.
Okay.
So the other day I was talking to my brother, who's got to brag a little about him. He's doing a PhD in finance at an Ivy League university. So he's a pretty smart dude. He's a pretty smart dude. But he mentioned to me that he was talking about famines in third world countries, and it turns out that what the research is indicating is that the wrong thing to do if there's a famine in a third world country is to send them food. That's actually the wrong thing to do.
That sounds very Malthusian.
And no, it's not. It's much better than it sounds. I know that sounds terrible. I promise it's not, and I'll explain why. The reason why is because the problem, you'll often have countries that are, and apparently this happened to Ireland during the potato famine. Ireland is exporting food while its people are starving.
Yeah.
Right? The problem often is not that there's not enough food in the country. It's that there are political incentives to keep the food out of the hands of certain people. And there's certainly enough food in the world. Like, the world produces enough food. And if you don't believe that, look at your garbage disposal, right? The problem is distribution. And my brother also mentioned another interesting fact, which is there has apparently never been a famine in a developed democracy, ever. And the going theory is that's not because these developed democracies are so much better at growing food. It's not like they don't have crop failures. It's not like they don't have, adverse shocks. But it's a stable society. It's a stable society that can get food into people's hands. And so I guess indirectly, that is kind of a little, plug in favor of cities that we actually are pretty good at getting food to
The
people.
mutual trust fall is not only beneficial, it's managed to work.
Now, having said that, and this is kind of what you were alluding to, I think that there's still a huge risk there, right? Even if there's a low probability of the food supply closing off, well, if it's not zero, at some point it will happen, and then you will all die unless you have chickens who are not dependent upon the financial system, et cetera.
Sure.
And that's not even bringing in, particularly in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic, people remember things like this, and they will think, a plague hit the world once. It could happen again. And it could be a lot worse for round two.
Well,
so there are strong anti-city arguments, even, I think there are strong anti-city arguments, even though I'm more sanguine.
I think of the coronavirus as a test run, personally. I mean, as cynical and horrible as that sounds, most of the hiccups that we've had with the coronavirus have been political, not in terms of the disease itself. I mean, it's been bad, sure. Is it the 1918 plague? No. 1918 plague took 20% and it hit the young and healthy first, and most virulently. And now we're well below 1% in terms of fatalities with the coronavirus. So it's not the same game. And the weird thing is, 1918 could happen again.
Or worse.
Or worse.
Right.
Yeah.
There's no particular reason why you couldn't have another disease outbreak. I mean, and to be honest, let's be very frank here, governments do experiment with diseases. And there are, fairly legitimate reasons for that. Even if you think it's really scary, there's still fairly legitimate reasons.
And accidents happen.
And accidents or things on purpose, all kinds of things happen.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, there's no particular reason why we couldn't have, another disease outbreak that kills people at a 40% rate. And people will know that.
Yeah. Well, they'll notice for sure. The thing so mutual trust falls, I think, are a beautiful thing. Every marriage is a beautiful thing because it's two people trusting each other and managing to make it work, despite the fact that, to a very great degree, every marriage is two people with a knife held to the other person's neck. You know each other in the most sensitive, intimate places, and you can hurt each other. That's a thing, that you can hurt each other. Cities are kind of like that same sort of trust relationship, just magnified with millions of people that you didn't actually choose. And the fact that you make it work is an impressive, beautiful thing. All hail society. I see a major difference between a trust fall that's taking place over padding or over maybe a cement floor at 4 feet where it's going to, bruise an elbow, maybe give you a black eye, as opposed to one that's conducted, say, on the spires of city buildings over, hundreds of stories down to the ground where you will splat rather than thunk.
There's some very Talebian lessons here about the asymmetry of upsides and downsides. They're not the same.
Yes, and I love the upsides of the city. I love the convenience of the city. When I'm here in the city, I have restaurants that I enjoy that I don't have back in the country where I live. But I am willing to make those sacrifices, and they're not even that much of a sacrifice. I live comfortably and well in the country where I am. I mean, the taps work just as well, and Netflix works just as well. I mean, my life is really good. But the trust fall is of such a different kind that I have a measure of security that I cannot have if I live in the city.
And for me, and I'm not talking smack about moving out to the country because, well, I'm just not, right, obviously. But one thing that really, my particular area of concern is, I visit people, I visit friends in their townhomes and their suburban homes, and I look at that and I'm like, dude, this is fragile, right? Could you have a kitchen garden? Do you have food storage? What is your insurance policy here, right? Insurance policy in the way we've been talking about, right? Not a financial insurance
What's
policy.
your backup plan?
Yeah, what is your backup plan, right?
Yeah.
And so I look at, I'm like, well, if you're in a suburban home or a townhome, could we look at a kitchen garden? Could we look at some kind of home production? Could we look at something like that, right?
Yeah.
Or could you pick up everything and, move to a more rural area, which could also be a really great option. But for me particularly, I look at people in apartments and people in townhomes and people in suburban homes, and I'm like, even if you are not going to move to a town with population 10,000, like, you're in a risky position. Surely there's something you could do.
There is. Part of my personal reluctance to live in a city is personal. I'm extremely creative and I have anti-authoritarian tendencies, and therefore I like having enough physical space to, let's say, do blacksmithing at 9 o'clock at night without getting an angry call from the neighbors, or to light bonfires in the backyard. Like, that requires a certain minimum amount of space before the neighbors start feeling very, very nervous whenever you do that. And so I think about the minimum amount of space that you have to have in order to have what I would call an autonomous life, where what you do actually doesn't affect the neighbors enough that they have a right and vested interest in what you're doing. So if you have paper-thin walls, then what you play on the TV and how loud you play it matter. I mean, that is a discussion that you have to have with your neighbors, and you have to negotiate that. If you have a quarter mile between you and the next neighbor, you don't have to have that discussion ever. If you have even a half acre around you, which is approximately twice the size of the average suburban backyard, then at that point you have a fair amount of autonomy. So it doesn't have to be huge. We're not talking about rolling Montana all to yourself.
There are scales, there are levels, right?
Yeah. And the level of crazy creativity that you want to engage in.
Yeah, depending on your preferences and things, like you can choose an appropriate place there.
There's also some math attached to how much land, if you're talking raw numbers for how much it would take to be 100% self-sustaining, that number is just over an acre if you want to have some chickens, some goats, and then provide the rest of it on fruits and vegetables. If you want to go full vegetarian...
1 acre for one person, you said?
No, for like a family of 4.
Okay.
We're talking about a family of 4, 1.5 acres, something like that. If you were to drop to a fully vegetarian diet for that family of 4, that amount of land drops to less than an acre. So it's interesting. Lifestyle affects the amount of physical space that you need in order to exercise your faculties and be sufficient. Like, sufficient is a number that is different based off of a lot of factors. How many kids you have, how much you like to eat meat, how much you like to do noisy projects in the backyard, whether or not you have a garage band.
I want to return. Sorry, this is a slight segue, so we can return to this. But it's just worth mentioning that. So you were talking about how if you're on say 40 acres, right? Like you can blast music.
You can blast dynamite.
You can do any. I mean,
you can fire a shotgun out of the back door and the trajectory of your bullets will still land on your land by the time they end.
Yeah.
Like, you can do that kind of
very,
stuff.
very, very safe.
Yeah.
Right, and whereas I'll remember. Sorry, and this is kind of a dumb example, but I went with my family on a vacation to California, and we stayed at a home pretty near the beach, and we were in the second floor, and there were other people on the first floor, right? And then obviously the houses, they're crammed in there because everybody wants a house next to the beach. And, the house doesn't have to be that large because, presumably you're spending all your time at the beach anyway.
Yeah.
Right? And it occurred to me that, like, human rights and even legal rights look different in different spaces.
They do.
You do have a right to blast music or dynamite at 2 a.m. on your 400 acres, right? You don't have the right to blast music at 2 a.m. On a beach house in California where you're crammed in with a bunch of other people, because yes, you actually are disturbing them, right? You actually are treading on their lives, right?
But in that case, you have a preserved commons, which is the beach that everyone has access to.
Sure.
And that your home is just providing you that access point to this thing that we all share.
Yeah, and then
you all have
obviously there are ways to negotiate this, which is why places like California exist, is because we actually have kind of negotiated this out, right? But it's just interesting to me, so I kind of pull a couple lessons from that. One is, that's interesting. So if you move out to the country, you actually have more rights.
Yes.
Another interesting thing I pull out is, and this is the real big segue, is I wonder how much, like a lot of people have talked about the way that political conflict in the United States right now seems to mirror the urban-rural divide. And there needs to be a big asterisk next to that statement.
It's disturbing.
It's way more complicated than that.
Sure, it's more complicated,
but you can...
The general trend sticks, and it sticks scarily well.
It sticks well enough that it's worth paying attention to.
If you look at the 2016 map in particular, if you break it down by states, you're like red states, blue states, well, that's interesting. If you break it down by county, it's city versus country.
Oh, yeah.
It's flat.
Yes.
The entire country versus all the cities.
And
unfortunately, well, I say unfortunately because I have a vested interest in the country, but that unfortunately the country at this point of the entire United States, everything that's rural, has slightly less population than a few hyper-concentrated little, I would call them abnormalities, but that's just me talking about the megalopolises in a negative light, because they are collective trust falls that are managing to work, and that is a beautiful thing.
From another perspective, there are more people in the cities than in the country.
Democracy.
Therefore, the country is the abnormality.
Or the holdout, the bunch of Luddites standing in the way of progress or whatever.
Sure. Anyway, the interesting conclusion I derive from that is that it's possible that a lot of what's driving political conflict in the United States is the fact that people actually are living in different realities, and maybe you need different rules for those different realities.
Which means they wouldn't have to vote together.
Yeah, I mean there's a whole complicated discussion attached to that, right?
Well,
like, do you reform all the states? What do you do because of that? I have no freaking clue, and I don't think we're getting into that today.
Nope.
But it's interesting to note.
It is interesting because one other lesson that you can pull from that is that the country and the city affect the way that you think enough to affect the way you vote. And that's the thing that we see by the numbers. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that all the people in the country are backward and whatever and lack education? Maybe.
Or conversely, that everybody in the city is an ignorant sap who doesn't understand the risks that they're running.
And it is
until the coronavirus pandemic, or disconnected from reality.
Or is it some complicated mixture of the above, and that's just how the coalitions have shaked out? Maybe. Shooken out? Have shaked out?
Shooked.
Have shooked. Have shooked. That sounds so wrong. The interesting thing that I want to point out, though, is that country living and self-reliance does seem to have an effect on the internal psychological world. It's not just about the security that you feel, it's also about your relationship with death. Your relationship with death, let's say with house cats. My wife grew up for a number of years in Idaho, and in Idaho, house cats are part of the food chain. And it's fairly normal, like if...
Meaning that there are things below them and also things above them.
And things above them. Yes. And so hawks carry off kittens. So it is a normal thing to raise a litter of cats. They don't spay or neuter their cats because they don't last long enough.
Oh my God.
And so you'll have a litter with like 12 kittens, and you name them. And by the end of the summer, there are 3. And then by the end of the winter, there's 1, and it's a female, and it births the new litter. And then you have your new crop of cats for the next year.
And that is the circle of life.
And that is the circle of life. Oh, Simba, this is how it works. So your relationship with death and rebirth and production and understanding where your food comes from and how life works and how risky life actually is, I would submit that you get a better sense for those things in a rural environment than you do in the city. In the city, you get much more of what we call street smarts, which is an almost cynical understanding of human nature and the way that people can hurt you.
It does feel very sort of sophistical.
Sophisticated, maybe.
Sophistical is in the Greek sophists.
Sure. Right. You lay that out.
Sure. Okay, yeah, I may have opened a can of worms, so we will have to force a lid on this can within like 3 minutes here. Because there's a long discussion here. But I think of, so in ancient Greece, there's a group of people called the Sophists, and it's a very loose group, and nobody agrees about who the Sophists are.
It's a label.
It's a label that people throw around, and they're not all in one group together necessarily either. But basically what they are is they're traveling teachers of rhetoric, traveling teachers of public speaking and writing. And one of the things that the opponents of the Sophists say again and again is, well, you're just teaching people to suck up to the crowd, right? Like you're just teaching people to lie and to make flattering speeches. When we talk about like sophistry or empty rhetoric, the argument against the Sophists is this is what you do, and therefore, you are a plague and a cancer upon our society.
Pandering.
Yes, which is exactly what Plato says, is right. Like you're a bunch of panderers, right? You're a bunch of suck-ups. You're a bunch of sycophants. Like when you think of like the stereotypical slimy politician, that's what the people in ancient Greece who don't like the Sophists think about the Sophists. and honestly, a lot of that continues today. Like when I think of, like when you think of like a lot of, I don't want I want to say white collar professions, but that's not quite it, right? Like
City living?
City living, a lot of it, like you live in a very social reality. In some ways, you live in a more social reality than you do out in the country.
This is a critique that's made by that book that you hated so much, Shop Class of Soulcraft, which is that in a large corporation, it is more conceivable to have a person who is so disconnected from the direct fruits of his labor or her labor that he or she is judged more by performance reviews from middle management than they are by any actual contribution to the bottom line.
Yes.
Whereas if you're, say, a carpenter or a plumber, it either worked or it didn't, and you can see the result. And
success feels a lot easier to identify.
You're judged more by external reality and less by other people. Like, it does not matter if someone else thinks it will work, it matters if it worked.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I actually think the phrasing is important. I would not say it is determined by an external reality. I would just say it's easier to tell.
Fair.
Because if somebody doesn't think that the plumbing works, they actually will call the plumber back repeatedly and tell them that it's, by the way, I mean, this happens in tech support, right? Where, you're...
Have you tried turning it off and on again?
The user is like, it doesn't work, and the technician is like, it works, you're not using it right. You're the problem, it's not the problem, but there's still a problem because the person doesn't understand, right?
Sure.
I mean, it's not like objective reality doesn't exist there, but it isn't. There are a lot of other factors.
And it isn't like there isn't objective reality in working with people. That's why sophists can have something to teach, because there are principles.
And also why occasionally, like, big businesses do fail, right? Like, even if you are a titan who has dominated the American industry.
If you look at the Fortune, is it the Fortune 500 list? No, it's one of the smaller lists, like the top 50 corporations of a particular decade. If you look at 4 decades ago and look at how many of them are still alive, it's usually a shockingly small number. So the big giants, we think of them as being immortal. In actual practice, they're really not.
They're very not. And if you want a very concrete example of this, think of Sears. A lot of people aren't aware that Sears was the Amazon of the 20th century. It's just that instead of being accessed through a web browser, they send out a catalog. But it was the store for everything, that you could buy anything and have it shipped to your door. And Sears was absolutely run into the ground, and I actually do not know their exact status right now, but I do know that they are in deep, deep, deep trouble.
Yeah.
Right. But people, yeah. So I mean, that's a very concrete example, and now we need to put a lid on this thing because we wandered way away from homesteading.
Homesteading. So is it a good idea? So let's narrow this down to a couple of specific questions. One, is homesteading desirable to people today? I submit that it is. If you produce your own stuff, you have a degree of security, autonomy. I think it actually does good things for you psychologically, in terms of being competent and creative and making things. Like, there is a joy in making things. It's not just that you have stuff, it's that you made it. Admit that that's cool. I mean, if you were to sell your own clothes, it's not that you have clothes, it's that, no, these are custom. I made these. Someday I will do that. If you make the brownies, it's, no, I made these brownies, and they are made to my taste and specifications. So there's something to that, and I think it's desirable. For the security element, particularly in times as uncertain politically and in terms of disease or supply lines or your access to your Amazon stuff, I think there's a really strong argument to be made that the security angle alone is enough reason to homestead. So is it desirable? Question one. Question two, is it going to increase? Is this a thing that is or should be happening?
I mean, I think we do agree. We will have to wait and see if this is what happens. But I think we both do agree, right? Like, if homesteading happens, if there is an increase in homesteading, moving back to the country, that sense of homesteading. If there's an increase in moving back to the country after major economic shocks, well, ta-da, we just had a major economic shock. 2 and 2 make 4. Yes, there will be an increase in homesteading.
Yeah.
To me, the most interesting question is, okay, well, what will it look like? Because 2020 is a different place than 1930.
Yeah.
These are actually quite different places.
For one thing, solar's cheaper.
Yeah, for one thing,
it exists. Solar panels in their theoretical phase were invented in the 1880s.
Well, and also, I mean, what is a plant but a solar panel? Right?
Yeah.
It's just that instead of generating electricity, if you could make a plant that generates electricity...
there have been studies done in that direction.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
But yeah, instead of generating electricity, they generate, nutrients that are wonderful for human bodies and sustain them.
Slam a carbon dioxide and a water molecule together, boom, we got sugar. Let's run the entire universe on it.
Yeah. So I guess at least to me, the most interesting question is it going to happen? Yes. Okay, so what is it going to look like this time around?
And is there a critical mass where it becomes normal? Will homesteading be normalized?
Okay, now there's a bigger question, right?
Mm-hmm.
And here's another question: is how normal is normal, right? Because 10% is a small number relative to 90%.
But it means everybody knows one.
Yeah, like 10% is a pretty big number.
Everybody knows a Mormon, a Latter-day Saint.
Yeah.
But a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But they're still a shockingly small minority.
Yeah.
So,
or I mean, like think about Apple, right? Think about Apple computers. Small portion of the total marketplace, but everybody knows who they are, and everybody knows what it's like, and everybody can choose one if they want one.
yes.
I mean, are you going to conjecture about that? Or are we going to say 1%, 10%, 100%?
Is it sufficiently part of the Overton window that it is a normal, acceptable, and would I say even a status-granting course of action?
I would like to say something about this.
Sure.
So there's a podcast that I listen to, and I will even give them a free plug. It is called Post Corona. It's not my favorite podcast ever, but it is a good podcast, and as you can probably guess from the title, it's a guy who invites on experts every week to interview them about different aspects of what the post-corona world might look like. So they did 2 episodes on New York City, which were not terribly interesting to me because I don't particularly care about New York City. It's just not like a major concern for me.
You don't live
God bless them and send them on their way, right?
Yes.
But it's just not directly touching my concerns. But what was so interesting to me about it is that the guy who was on has quite a bit of experience with the theater industry, and he, I do not remember the number, but it was a shockingly large percentage of New York's economy that is directly tied to Broadway. In terms of food service, hospitality, like think about it, right? Like
people coming to town for this purpose. So it's like the tourism industry for New York City is tied up in Broadway.
Yes, it is a shockingly large number.
And that's food, that's housing, that's transportation, that's
all the other. I mean, you don't just come and watch one Broadway show. You're going to do other stuff in town. You're going to see this. You're going to see that. You're going to do the other. And all of these, these restaurants. People are being employed this way, right? Like. It's a shockingly large part of the New York economy. And so I got to thinking, well, media has been more accessible. I mean, it's more accessible now than ever before because, as you said, Hulu is streaming everywhere, right? Like, I can watch the latest episode of The Mandalorian, and I can do it from, like, the most random places on Earth. I can do it from the middle of nowhere.
And that's how people are now watching movie releases.
With the rise
at the theater.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll see how much that persists. It's a question mark, right? It's a question mark, right? Anyway, so I kind of squint at that, and I'm like, okay, like, here's a good question. How much do people love the live theater experience? Because to me, I don't know how much I really care about it, but I recognize and assume that there are lots of people to whom it is very important.
That's one of my favorite dates with my wife. And
there you go. Even beyond that, if it weren't for that, then presumably New York would not exist, according to this guy, because this live theater experience is such a significant portion of what makes New York City, New York City.
Yeah.
But I just wonder, especially because like the margins for some of these businesses are incredibly small, right? You start knocking out 5, 10, 15% of their customer base, and these businesses just die. They cannot afford a hit like that, right? It's not that 50% of their customers have to leave. It's not that 90% of their customers have to leave. Like, relatively small shocks can just put them out of existence, right? And so okay, sorry, I'm bringing this back. When I think about New York City, what I'm interested in is, okay, so if New York City is, say, I can't remember what the number was, but say 30% Broadway, and if Broadway is no longer as culturally important, like, do cities stay as culturally important? Like, I guess what I'm asking is, why are you going to go to a city? Are you going to go there to work? Well, a lot of people don't have that as a reason anymore, right? Are you going to go there to see Broadway? Well, how's that going to look? It's possible that it will look different. I mean, why do you need to be in close proximity to a ton of people, right? And when I say a ton of people, I'm talking in the millions, right? I mean, even in a suburban neighborhood or even in a rural community, like you've still got there are a lot of people around you. It's not like there aren't social events. It's not like you are alone in your room the whole time. It's not like that, right? But I just wonder, like, what are cities good for now? Like, what are they going to be useful for?
What are they uniquely good for?
Yeah.
That's another question.
Yeah, what's their competitive advantage versus suburbia or versus rural towns? Because the competitive advantage used to be, well, this is where everything's happening.
Yeah.
And now I squint at it and I'm like, will everything be happening there? Because a lot of work's not going to be happening there. A lot will, but a lot won't. Some live entertainment isn't going to be happening there.
I don't think the cities ever go away completely. So my personal suspicion is that some things like really high-end symphonies or really high-end Broadway type performances are always going to be concentrated, and you're going to have talent concentrated in a particular geographic area. Cities are always going to have competitive advantage in some things. Some businesses are going to want to maintain tight control in a particular place. Certain contacts, harbors stay harbors no matter what happens to the internet.
But I mean, there's some asterisks next to that too, because if in our hypothetical 2050 universe where like Elon Musk has built drones that have replaced cargo ships, well, it can just fly wherever. It doesn't need to land in San Francisco or wherever. I mean, but hang on. I do want to say something there though, because like even if there's a 5% shock to large cities or a 10% shock to large cities,
maybe
or
they
15%,
depopulate by 30%.
Yeah, and even if that shock only results in like 15%, well, like 15% population shift, that's huge. Like going back to earlier, I'm not going to say it, but I'm going to say it. Like think of the political ramifications, right?
Yeah.
And also think of the cultural ramifications, right? Like think like if 15% of people leave New York City for upstate New York, a lot of things look different really fast.
Yeah. Well,
and it's conceivable. It could happen.
For one thing, the coalitions would shift. It would stop being country versus city. It would be country versus country and city versus city, and it would be healthier, I think, significally healthier. So
Actually,
I do want to add in one point that's kind of interesting here, and that is that there is a book called Farmer Boy. It's one of the Little House on the Prairie books. And at the end, there's this statement made, this kind of revelation where it describes a set of values that the independent farmer who is raising the main character, Almanzo, is independent. He provides his own food. His family can eat comfortably based off of what he provides indefinitely. And as a result, he sees himself having a degree of autonomy socially where he can say whatever he wants to anyone. He doesn't have to hold anything back. His ability to have teeth and negotiate harshly is not constrained by anyone controlling his paycheck. And I'm imagining, let's imagine that part-time he works at a factory. And part-time at that factory, let's say the conditions are bad and they decide to go on strike. How long can he go on strike?
long time.
Yeah.
Indefinitely until, barring some other kind of, barring another move, barring some other type of shock.
Something else happening, and if he's working in a factory, you can assume he needs the income to at least some degree, right? To repair his tractors, whatever. But one thing that I find interesting about the Ralph Borsodi book, plug for this, he mentioned that after his homestead started to build, he noticed that he was actually making more money from the employment that he kept because all of his employers knew that he could leave at any time. And so he said he makes some quote along the lines of, it's remarkable how much more people value your contributions when they know that you don't have to give them. And so let's say he goes in and asks for a raise, and is his boss going to strong arm him and say, well, where else would you go? No, I have options, and I can say no to you at any time.
And not only that, it's not even just that he could go and be employed somewhere else. He could go and be employed somewhere else after waiting for a year. Or he could just not go be employed somewhere else.
Yeah.
He has a lot of options.
Lots and lots of options and no time constraint. Like if you're living paycheck to paycheck and you want to quit your job and find another one, you got time limits because the credit card bill is coming due and you've got like 2 weeks to find a job. And so sign me up McDonald's, that's where I go.
Yeah. At least in the meantime.
Yeah,
right.
At least in the meantime.
You're much more constrained. And it's worth mentioning you're less constrained. Even if you don't grow your own food, even if you just have a month or 6 months or a year's worth of food storage, that just gives you more negotiating time.
Yeah.
Right. There was.
It's very similar to the example of going on strike. Your ability to go on strike is limited by your savings. It's totally siege warfare.
Yeah. You've mentioned this, right? That it's this bizarre. It's siege warfare in the modern era,
which is duel of the pantries.
Yeah.
It always has
a duel of the pantries. I was just thinking. There was a time when my dad this was like, how long ago was was this? This was like 8 years ago, maybe. But he was unemployed for a while. He was, hang on, 8 years ago. No, that's like 2012. So that is after the Great Recession. Anyway, he was unemployed, and in large part because like he has done a really good job of stocking up food, and he has gosh, how big is the garden? It's probably in the range of like a quarter acre, a third of an acre is the size of the total garden and orchard, right? Like, he could wait and find a job that he actually liked.
Mm-hmm. He had the luxury of time.
Yeah, which matters, right?
Yeah. The trouble then becomes access to enough capital to start your homestead.
Mm-hmm.
And for that, I mean, there are sneaky ways to go about it. I'm doing research into community land trusts, or CLTs, which is where you basically get the bulk discount. You have a group buy a large area of land in trust and then give life estates to the individual homesteaders on 3-acre plots. One foundation that's been doing this since Borsodi's day is the School of Living organization. You also have numerous others, like the CLT idea is one that kind of springs up. Other ways of doing it, I mean, getting a mortgage out in, let's say, Kansas is not hard if you have any kind of remote work. If you have any kind of remote work, I mean, you can find land in Kansas for $1,000 an acre. There are even parts in Utah and Nevada where you can find it for $1,000 an acre. There are ways to get access to land because, frankly, it's not as far out of your grasp as you would like to imagine. When you think about city land prices, they're ridiculously hyperinflated. But once you move to the country, the crazy thing is that the prices drop and it becomes accessible. And there are tools. I mean, solar's dropping. Access to capital is actually becoming easier now than it ever has been. So it's not the crippling, holdout only of the privilege that it maybe once was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I for one, I have lots of ideas about sort of how the next phase of homesteading should go, but mostly I am excited to see what people come up with.
Yeah.
Right. Like there are probably all kinds of solutions that you and I haven't thought of. And by the way, those of you listening to this podcast, if you want to tell us about it, on YouTube, if you watch this video on YouTube, then obviously you can leave comments. I'm interested to hear good ideas. How should the next phase of the homesteading revolution, Vive la Revolution, how should it go, right? Like,
yeah.
what are the good strategies? And
how do you increase access to the 3 acres and a cow, and how do you
Yeah.
make building easier, and how do you make it easier to get started and get your foot in the door so that you can produce your own stuff? One thing, Ralph Borsodi has a chapter on capital. I believe it's chapter 10, if you're interested in listening to that, where he talks about the amount of capital it takes to get started. And the thing that's interesting about this is it doesn't take that much, but once you start producing things yourself, you are the capitalist. You start snowballing. Your capital starts to beget more capital. I mean, you buy 2 goats and pretty soon it's 8, as long as you've got enough land to feed them on.
Or you sell the goats and you've got some financial capital.
And then you've got financial capital, which translates into a house, and then eventually buildings start multiplying.
Whatever other kind of capital you
So long as you avoid debt like the plague and have some decent management, you're okay.
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, this is just, sort of a universal law of finance, and maybe even a more universal law, right? Is that like, if you have something, it's a lot easier to increase it, right?
Yeah.
It's very hard to go from 0 to 1. It's a lot easier to go from 0 to 2, and to go from, some much larger number to some...
From 1 to 2?
Yeah. And to go from some much larger number to another larger number is even easier.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, this is true for YouTube subscribers. This is true for
sure.
so many things.
For sure, and there's a place for charities, for support organizations, for organizations that bring people together to try to make that easier, for parents helping out children getting their first leg up the same way that parents help children go through college today. I mean, your parents help you buy your first acre or something like that.
Which, to be fair, I can think of some college educations that are probably not worth as much as an acre. So.
Yeah, maybe that should be the standard of value that we apply. Is this education worth as much or more than an acre? If it's worth way more than an acre, do it. If it's worth way less than an acre,
we need some kind of mathematical ratio, like how many acres is each lecture in college worth?
Yeah.
There's probably a way to do it, actually.
That actually would be a really fun project. Let's get some finance professor on it.
If only I knew somebody who's... Yeah. Okay, so is there anything else we want to hit on before we wrap up?
So... my intuitions are that homesteading has never been easier than it is now. If you think about it, people have been able to provide for their own needs in the past. And that's a thing that actually happened, otherwise you wouldn't be here today. And we have more stuff than they did, which means anything they could do, we can do with the new stuff. Which means all the time that a washer and dryer gave you back in the day is time that you could homestead and do more. And all the information that we have about modern farming practices and permaculture and all this stuff is stuff that you could... I don't only think that this is a doable lifestyle, I think that it's actually a way to get more time off than you've ever had in your life, a more engaging, fulfilling, interesting career than you ever thought you could have, to have more security, peace of mind, plenty. I think it's actually a way to enjoy more wealth than you could in any other way. I mean, when all your meals, let's say that you took some time and learned how to cook well, and cook at kind of a amateur chef level. Well, imagine how much you would have to spend in order to eat at that level every day of your life. Your quality of life has just taken a permanent bump up. And if you're providing for your home, your space, everything that way, just imagine how good your life could be. I think that there's serious potential not only in terms of, you know, eating gruel and living, existing, but in really living and living well through this model. So that's my 2 bits.
All right. For me, I'm just kind of interested to see what happens. I'm not used to quoting Mao Zedong favorably, but let 1,000 flowers bloom.
Sure.
You know, I'm kind of interested in seeing how it all shakes out. I certainly think that there's a lot of potential here in terms of homesteading, moving to rural areas, home production, increased independence. I certainly think that there are all kinds of there's all kinds of potential here that has not been tapped and maybe hasn't even been discovered, and I look forward to hopefully seeing it all.
So one cautionary tale, actually a cautionary tale about cautionary tales. This is a meta cautionary tale in a way. Homesteading is an interesting thing to me because it has been popular before, and then it went through phases where it was not. Mm-hmm. And that tells you very interesting things. If you look at the data for movement from the country to the city, it's generally speaking one way, country to the city. And then you look at the years after 1929 when the stock market crash happened and the flow starts to go the other way, out of the city back to the country. And then after the crises are over, it flows back. And I actually have a personal connection to one of these back to the land movement stories. My maternal grandparents on both sides, both of them, were raised on small self-sustaining farms. And I'll briefly tell both stories because I think both of them are very, very interesting. In the one case, my great-grandfather really wanted to become self-sustaining. He was a smelter worker. He worked in the smelters that were here in Utah, and the Depression was awful for him, and he wanted to be his own farmer. He'd tried wheat farming in Idaho before and not made much money at it. And then he started a chicken business pretty close to the beginning of the Depression. The Depression absolutely destroyed it. People were not able to spend money on eggs, and he didn't have anything but eggs and chickens. And so they went around trying to sell dead chickens and, find any way that they could to make any sort of income off of what they had. After it eventually drove into the dirt, the dream stayed alive for him. He desperately wanted to be self-sustaining so that he wasn't subject to the economy in the same way that he was as a worker, constantly wondering if he was going to have enough work. So he eventually finds some land, 30 acres, buys it, gets some horses so that he can provide his own feed, because tractors are very difficult to feed with grain.
The life cycle of producing petroleum is just a little longer, yeah.
Yeah, longer time scale. You bury the compressed vegetable matter, eventually becomes coal, but he didn't have that long to wait. So with that for background, my grandmother grew up on a self-sustaining homestead like this, 30 acres, all kinds of crops, large kitchen garden. They also had some sidelines. My great-grandmother was a florist and ran a florist's shop out of her home refrigerator. Eventually they had to get more refrigerators to hold all the flowers, and made some money off of that. And she remembers growing up in a home that didn't always have very much money, but always had more than enough food. And that was normal. Same for my grandfather to a greater or lesser extent. My great-grandfather was a college professor in the University of Utah. He was an astronomy and mathematics professor and a part-time farmer who provided almost all his own food from home. He ran the farm during the summers and then ran off to the winters to go to the University of Chicago to finish his PhD. And that was the lifestyle that both of my grandparents grew up in. Now, they maintained a large garden through raising my mother, but it wasn't the same level of self-sufficiency, and it tapered off. And they farmed some of the acreage that they had been left, but it was just alfalfa, and mostly it was just to keep the land doing something. And I just wonder, because the deep-seated in the gut dream to have a homestead seems to have tapered off with the generations. My parents garden some, but it's not nearly enough to provide any of their needs. It's mostly a hobby that provides salsa. And so I just wonder that in the history of homesteading, there have been these booms where it's a big deal, and it's almost always around horrific crises, both world wars, the Dig for Victory campaigns that encouraged kitchen gardens and meat clubs, where people would pitch in together to raise a pig on scraps and then share the pork, or the 1930s when people were desperately trying to get to the land because that's the only place you could find security to feed your children, or the 1970s with the oil crisis and all the concern that we had over the environmental issues. And then most recently with 2008, there's been a resurgence of interest, and a lot of these old books from the 70s and 30s are suddenly popular again. What I wonder is there a way to make homesteading self-sustaining, not just self-sufficient, to where it can last more than one generation and be a desirable, wholesome, good way of living that can last more than a crisis and become a good new normal, like a genuinely good new normal. Because most of the time when I hear that phrase, it's not good stuff that I'm hearing, but what if the small farm could again become a new normal? It seems that this is a perennial problem. I mean, the Romans struggled with this with the Gracchan land reforms. They had problems with small farmers getting bought up by bigger farmers, and increasing income inequality and all the same stuff that we're dealing with. But I firmly believe that homesteading has never been more possible than it is today, thanks to the technologies that make it more accessible. The capital to start a farm and be self-sufficient with electricity has never been easier than right now. Is it enough?
Yeah, I mean, good question, right?
Yeah.
And the best part of being alive is that we get to find out the answer.
Yeah. We're time travelers in exactly one direction, and at exactly one speed.
Yes. 24 hours per day.
24 hours per day.
60 seconds per hour.
Okay. Well, we'll see what happens
Very
tomorrow.
fixed rate.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that will wrap it up. If you do want to, interact with what we've said or give us feedback, obviously through the podcast format, it's a little more difficult, but you can find this video on YouTube and visit us in the comments section there, obviously. And then also there's lots of other videos there too. We sure enjoy hearing from you. We love talking to you. So thank you very much for listening as always, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, and bye-bye.